The night was alive with the glow of chandeliers and the soft murmur of conversation spilling out from the grand hall. Outside, the scene was no less extravagant. Rows of luxury cars lined the red carpet, their polished surfaces gleaming under the golden lights of the prestigious Hawthorne Hotel. The event, a gala celebrating the year's top innovators, was nothing short of a spectacle, attracting the city's elite. John Carter adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror of the sleek black sedan he was driving. The reflection stared back at him, calm and composed, though his heart raced beneath the surface. Tonight wasn't just another event. Tonight was the culmination of years of hard work, and John wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to watch and wait. In the backseat, his colleague, the face of their company for public events, glanced at her phone. She was the one who'd be shaking hands and giving speeches tonight, while John preferred to stay behind the scenes. It was safer that way. The tech world, after all, was more about perception than reality, and John had learned the value of maintaining his quiet role. "Let's go," his colleague said briskly, and John stepped out of the car to open her door. The cameras flashed the moment her designer shoes touched the carpet. She turned, offering John a small nod of thanks before gliding toward the entrance. "Move it along," a sharp voice snapped behind him. John turned to see a tall woman, draped in a gown that seemed to sparkle as she moved. Victoria Hawthorne. Her name alone commanded respect, or at least fear, in the upper circles. She was the type of person who didn't just enter a room, she consumed it. "Are you just going to stand there?" she barked, motioning toward the line of cars waiting behind John's. He nodded once, stepping back to allow her chauffeur to pull up. The door to her car opened, and Victoria stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She glanced at John, her eyes raking over him, like he was something unpleasant stuck to her shoe. "Honestly, they'll let anyone wear a suit these days," she muttered, loud enough for him to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. John said nothing, his expression unreadable. He had dealt with people like her before, people who assumed his worth based on his role, his skin, his silence. But he wasn't here to fight battles tonight. Victoria moved past him without another word, her perfume lingering in the air like a weapon. John turned back to his car, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as he parked it away from the entrance. Inside the gala, the atmosphere was electric. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and the room buzzed with laughter and polite applause as speakers took the stage. John slipped into the hall unnoticed, blending into the background as he always did. From his position near the back, he could see Victoria holding court near the center of the room, her laughter too loud and her gestures too broad. She thrived on being the center of attention, and tonight was no exception. "Did you see the way he looked at me?" Victoria's voice carried over the crowd as she recounted her arrival to a group of equally well-dressed onlookers. "Like he didn't even know who I was. Honestly, some people need to learn their place." The group laughed, and John's jaw tightened. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. This wasn't the time to let emotions get in the way. The merger was the priority, and Victoria was already a potential obstacle. Her family's company stood to lose if his deal went through, and her disdain for him would only fuel her opposition. The night wore on, and John watched as Victoria's influence spread like oil over water, seeping into every conversation she joined. She was magnetic in the worst way, pulling people in with her charm and leaving them coated in her venom. At one point, she approached a waiter carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "What's this?" she asked, lifting a delicate canapé with her manicured fingers. "Quail egg. Ugh, who eats this?" She tossed it back onto the tray with a grimace. "People like you are only here to serve people like me," she added with a smirk, turning back to her companions as if she'd just delivered the punchline to a joke. John watched the waiter's face, saw the flicker of embarrassment before he quickly moved away. His own chest burned with a mix of anger and shame. He wanted to say something, to call her out, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. People like Victoria didn't hear voices like his. As the evening continued, Victoria's disdainful glances toward John didn't go unnoticed. Each time she passed him, she found a reason to comment. "Shouldn't you be parking cars or something?" she sneered at one point, her voice dripping with sarcasm. John simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't need to retaliate. He didn't need to explain himself. Because tomorrow, when the truth came out, her words would echo back to her with the force of a hammer. By the time the event began winding down, Victoria had taken the stage, delivering a speech filled with self-congratulations and subtle jabs at the competition. John stood in the shadows, his hands in his pockets, listening carefully. "This city needs leaders," Victoria declared, her voice ringing out over the applause. "People who understand hard work, who know what it means to build something from the ground up." Her eyes swept over the crowd, pausing briefly on John. Not everyone is cut out for that kind of responsibility. John's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to remain still. She didn't know, not yet. As the applause died down and the crowd began to disperse, John slipped out of the hall, his mind racing. He had achieved everything he had by staying focused, by staying calm. Tomorrow, Victoria would learn exactly who he was. And he would finally get to watch her fall. The sun beat down on the cracked pavement of the small neighborhood where John Carter had grown up. The streets were lined with worn-out cars and homes that bore the scars of time and neglect. But to John, it was home. He could still hear the laughter of kids playing basketball at the end of the block, the distant tune of a passing ice cream truck, and the comforting hum of his father's voice as he tinkered with an old radio in their small garage. "Let your work speak louder than your pride," his father would say, his hands covered in grease, but his eyes shining with wisdom. "They can take everything from you, son, money, respect, even your dignity, but they can't take what you've built with your own hands." Those words had stuck with John, becoming a mantra he clung to even as the world tried to knock him down. John had always been the quiet one, the boy who kept his head down but dreamed big. While others on the block found themselves trapped in cycles of despair, he found refuge in books and an old, second-hand computer his father had saved up to buy. It wasn't much, but to John, it was a portal to another world. A world where code could create anything and where success didn't depend on where you came from, but what you could do. "Johnny, you've been at that thing all day," his younger sister, Maya, would tease, leaning against the doorframe of their tiny shared bedroom. "Come on, we're playing outside. You need sunlight, or you'll turn into a computer." John would laugh, a rare but genuine sound, and shake his head. "One day, Maya, this computer's gonna change everything. You'll see." Maya would roll her eyes, but she never doubted him. She was his biggest cheerleader, the one who always believed in him, even when the odds were stacked against them. Their bond grew stronger after their father passed away. It was sudden, a heart attack that left a gaping hole in their lives. John had to step up, taking odd jobs to keep the lights on and food on the table. He sacrificed his dreams of college, but he never let go of his ambition. At night, when the world was asleep, he'd sit at that same old computer, teaching himself everything he could about programming, algorithms, and software design. Maya would sometimes wake up and find him there, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. "You're gonna burn yourself out," she'd whisper, but John would just smile. "I have to keep going. For Dad. For us." The breakthrough came when John was in his early 20s. He had developed a simple app that helped small businesses manage their inventory, a project born out of watching his neighbors struggle with their corner stores. He didn't think much of it at first, but word spread quickly, and soon he was receiving calls from business owners across the city. "You're onto something, big bro," Maya had said, pride evident in her voice. "But don't let them take advantage of you. Remember what Dad always said." John nodded, but the sting of the past always lingered. He remembered the countless job interviews where he'd been turned away without explanation, the subtle but cutting comments about his background, the way people would look at him as if he didn't belong. Success hadn't come easily, and even as his app gained traction, he faced resistance. Investors didn't take him seriously. Clients doubted his abilities. "You don't look like the guy who made this," one potential investor had said, scanning him up and down as though searching for flaws. John had smiled politely, swallowing the retort that burned on his tongue. Just let the work speak, he would remind himself, over and over, until it became a shield against the prejudice he faced. As the years went by, John's small app grew into a thriving business. He poured every ounce of himself into it, expanding the company, hiring talented people, and creating software that revolutionized how businesses operated. But through it all, he never forgot where he came from. He stayed grounded, thanks to Maya, who never let him get too full of himself. "Don't forget," she'd say with a grin, "you're still the kid who got beat at Mario Kart by his little sister." John's humility was both his greatest strength and his most significant vulnerability. He avoided the spotlight, preferring to let others represent the company publicly. It wasn't that he was ashamed, far from it. He just wanted the work to stand on its own, but that choice had its consequences. "Why don't you speak up more?" Maya asked one evening as they sat in his sleek, modern apartment. It was a far cry from the tiny house they'd grown up in, but John had kept little reminders of home, a framed photo of their dad, the old computer that had started it all. "Because people like me don't get second chances," he said simply. "If I mess up, they'll say it's because I wasn't good enough to begin with. I can't give them that excuse." Maya frowned, her eyes filled with a mix of understanding and frustration. "John, you've earned this. Don't let anyone make you feel like you haven't." But deep down, John couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far he'd come, he'd always be judged by where he started. And that fear, that quiet, knowing doubt, was something Victoria Hawthorne would unknowingly exploit. It was Maya who first warned him about people like Victoria. "They'll smile in your face and stab you in the back," she said after reading an article about one of Victoria's business dealings. "She doesn't see people, John. She sees opportunities or threats." John had laughed it off at the time, dismissing her concerns as paranoia. But now, as he stood in the shadows of the gala, watching Victoria move through the crowd with calculated precision, he realized Maya had been right. Victoria was everything his father had warned him about, someone who measured worth by wealth and status, who saw people as tools to be used or obstacles to be crushed. And tonight, she had set her sights on him, though she didn't even know it yet. As John reflected on his journey, the struggles, the sacrifices, the quiet victories, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He hadn't come this far to be pushed back into the shadows. He would face whatever challenges came his way, just as he always had. But as Victoria's laughter echoed across the room, sharp and mocking, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The storm was coming, and he would need every ounce of strength and resilience to weather it. The clinking of glasses and the hum of polite laughter filled the air as the gala reached its peak. Beneath the dazzling lights of the grand ballroom, everyone looked immaculate, their expensive suits and glittering gowns a reminder that this room held power, influence, and unimaginable wealth. John Carter stood near the back, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, blending into the background as he had perfected over the years. The polished marble beneath his shoes felt cold, a sharp contrast to the heat building in his chest every time he heard Victoria Hawthorne's voice cutting through the crowd. She was in her element. Draped in a gold gown that shimmered with every movement, Victoria commanded attention without effort. Her laugh, sharp, almost theatrical, rang out at just the right moments. Her words, though dripping with charm, carried a dangerous edge. John's eyes followed her as she moved from one group to another, her presence both magnetic and toxic. "You're all being too kind," Victoria purred to a circle of investors who hung on her every word. "But honestly, I have to say, the caliber of people they're letting into events like this has really shifted. Standards just aren't what they used to be." Her gaze flicked briefly in John's direction, the meaning unmistakable. John felt the heat rise in his face, but he kept his expression neutral. It wasn't the first time someone like Victoria had tried to diminish him. Still, the sting of her words settled like a stone in his chest. She didn't know who he was, what he had built, what he stood for, and that was exactly why she thought she could get away with it. As the night wore on, Victoria's disdainful glances toward him turned into pointed comments. At one point, she sauntered past him with an empty glass in hand and stopped just close enough to ensure he'd hear her next words. "Oh, you there," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Could you be a dear and get me a drink? Something sparkling, but make sure it's the good stuff, not the cheap Prosecco they serve to staff." John's eyes met hers, calm but piercing, as he slowly shook his head. "I think you'll find the bar is over there," he said quietly, his tone even. Victoria's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. She wasn't used to being refused, especially not by someone she saw as beneath her. She murmured, her lips curving into a tighter smile. "Well, I suppose even drivers have limits." She turned sharply on her heel, her gown swishing behind her as she rejoined her entourage. John exhaled slowly, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. Every fiber of his being screamed to confront her, to tell her exactly who he was, but he knew better. Revealing the truth now would only give her more ammunition to turn against him. He couldn't afford that, not tonight, not with so much at stake. The tension in the room seemed to follow Victoria wherever she went. She had a way of turning casual conversations into thinly veiled interrogations, digging for weaknesses she could exploit. At one point, John overheard her talking to a group of executives near the buffet table. "It's fascinating," she said, her tone light, but her words barbed. "I hear the company behind tonight's event is run by someone who prefers to stay out of the spotlight. Suspicious, don't you think? I mean, who hides like that unless they have something to hide?" One of the executives chuckled nervously. "Well, sometimes it's just about letting the product speak for itself," he offered. Victoria's laugh was sharp, cutting through the conversation like a blade. "Oh please. In this world, perception is everything. If you can't even show your face, how can anyone trust you?" John clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He knew her words were meant to plant seeds of doubt, to undermine his credibility before anyone even realized who he was. It wasn't just arrogance, it was strategy. Later that evening, John found himself stepping outside for a moment to clear his head. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. He leaned against the railing of the balcony, his thoughts swirling. He had worked so hard to build his company, to create something that mattered, but people like Victoria always seemed to find a way to chip away at that, as if his success was a threat to their existence. Voices from around the corner pulled him out of his thoughts. He recognized one of them immediately, Victoria. She was speaking in hushed tones, but the venom in her words was unmistakable. "I don't care how long it takes," she hissed. "That merger cannot go through. Do you understand me? If his company gets that deal, it'll crush everything we've built. My father didn't spend decades building our empire just for nobody to come in and dismantle it." John's heart stopped for a moment. His suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't just casual disdain. This was personal. Victoria wasn't just targeting him because she saw him as beneath her. She was trying to destroy everything he had worked for, everything he had built. Her next words sent a chill down his spine. "My father always said people like him don't know their place until you remind them. And trust me, I intend to remind him." John stepped back into the shadows, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, but at the same time, it all made sense. Victoria's disdain, her subtle digs, her attempts to undermine him, they weren't just random acts of cruelty. They were calculated moves to eliminate a perceived threat. But she didn't know the full story. She didn't know that John was already steps ahead, that he had built his company to withstand challenges like this. And she certainly didn't know that the nobody she was so determined to crush was standing just a few feet away, listening to every word. As Victoria's voice faded, replaced by the sound of her retreating footsteps, John felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about justice. About proving, not just to Victoria, but to everyone like her, that people like him didn't need to be reminded of their place, because they were already standing where they belonged. He straightened his tie, his gaze hardening as he turned back toward the ballroom. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was the fight. The air in the ballroom felt heavier now, not from the glittering chandeliers or the murmur of well-dressed guests, but from something intangible, an unease that gnawed at John Carter's focus. He could feel it in the way Victoria Hawthorne moved, her calculated grace shifting into something sharper, colder. She wasn't just a socialite floating through the evening anymore. She was watching. Her gaze darted across the room, landing on him more often than he liked. He had been careful, always careful, but tonight, cracks were beginning to show. John stood near the corner of the room, blending into the shadows as he always did, a quiet observer in a sea of noise. He kept his phone in his hand, appearing to check emails, but his screen was blank. Instead, his ears were attuned to the voices swirling around him, snippets of conversation floating just close enough to catch. Victoria had been speaking in hushed tones to a man in an impeccable navy suit moments earlier, their conversation clipped and tense. John couldn't make out every word, but what he heard was enough. "He's a nobody," Victoria had hissed, her voice low but venomous. "This merger falls through, and that's the end of it. No more charity cases pretending to play with the big boys." The man had chuckled nervously, as if he wasn't entirely sure if he should be agreeing, but Victoria didn't seem to notice or care. She dismissed him with a wave of her hand, her attention flickering back to the room. Her eyes swept past John without lingering, but he knew she was suspicious. She had noticed something earlier, maybe the way he held himself, the way he spoke just a little too confidently when she tried to cut him down. John took a steady breath, his fingers brushing against the pocket of his jacket where a small flash drive rested. It contained everything he needed: emails, financial records, and whispered plans Victoria thought no one would notice. It had taken weeks of subtle maneuvering, of accessing unsecured devices Victoria and her team treated carelessly in their arrogance. They had underestimated him, assuming he was just another face in the crowd, too insignificant to pose a threat. "Hey, you good?" Carlos's voice cut through his thoughts, low and calm. John glanced to his left, where his friend stood holding a tray of empty glasses, the uniform of a fellow chauffeur blending him into the background. Carlos had been his ally from the start, someone who knew how to move unnoticed through these events, hearing and seeing things no one intended him to. "Yeah," John murmured, but she's watching. She's getting suspicious. Carlos smirked, shaking his head slightly. She doesn't know half of it. Just keep playing it cool. You're not the one who should be nervous. John nodded but didn't reply. His eyes followed Victoria as she crossed the room again, her presence commanding attention even among the crowd. She paused near Emily, the event coordinator, her expression softening into something that might pass for politeness if you didn't know better. "Lovely evening," Victoria said, her tone sugary but sharp underneath. "Though I can't help but notice a few things out of place." Her gaze flicked toward a minor detail, a centerpiece slightly off-center, a tray of drinks too close to the edge of a table. Emily's smile didn't falter, but John could see the tension in her shoulders. She had confided in him earlier about Victoria's penchant for nitpicking, for finding tiny flaws and magnifying them until they felt like personal failures. "We'll take care of it right away," Emily said, her voice even but laced with quiet defiance. Victoria raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint, condescending smile. "I should hope so. Details matter, after all. It's what separates the exceptional from the average." John clenched his jaw, the words igniting a familiar flame of anger. He stepped forward instinctively, but Carlos's hand on his arm stopped him. "Not yet," Carlos murmured. "Pick your moment." John exhaled, forcing himself to relax. He couldn't afford to blow his cover now, not when he was so close to exposing Victoria for what she truly was. Instead, he waited, watching as Victoria moved away, leaving Emily standing there with a strained expression. A moment later, John joined Emily near the drinks table. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She looked up, her smile returning, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine. She's just exhausting." "That's one word for it," John said, his tone light, but his meaning clear. Emily hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You know, she's not just a perfectionist. She's manipulative. I've seen her ruin people's careers over things that weren't even their fault. She acts like she's untouchable." John nodded, his mind racing. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only strengthened his resolve. "What if she wasn't?" he said, almost to himself. Emily tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" John hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. Just, thanks for telling me." As the night wore on, Victoria's suspicion grew more evident. She caught John's eye across the room more than once, her gaze lingering just a beat too long. At one point, she approached him directly, her steps deliberate, and her expression unreadable. "Well, you've been quite the observer tonight," she said, her tone light but pointed. "Are you always this quiet, or is there something you're not telling us?" John smiled faintly, his posture relaxed despite the tension thrumming beneath the surface. "Just doing my job," he said evenly. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire room had gone silent. Then, she smiled, a sharp, calculated smile that didn't reach her eyes. Well, I suppose there's a first time for everything." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving John standing there with the distinct feeling that she was testing him, probing for weaknesses. He glanced at Carlos, who had been watching the exchange from a few feet away. "She knows something's up," John said quietly. Carlos shrugged, his expression calm. "Doesn't matter. She doesn't know enough." But John wasn't so sure. He could feel the noose tightening, the stakes rising with every passing moment. Victoria was dangerous, and if she uncovered the truth before he was ready, everything he had worked for could unravel in an instant. The night ended without further incident, but the unease lingered. John returned to his apartment, the flash drive burning a hole in his pocket. He sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen as he reviewed the files he had gathered. Emails, financial records, voice recordings, it was all there. A damning trail of evidence that painted a clear picture of Victoria's corruption and manipulation. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. He needed more, something undeniable, something that would leave no room for doubt. As he leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed with a message from Carlos. "Carlos, you're almost there. Don't let her get in your head." John stared at the screen for a moment before typing a reply. "John, she's already in my head, but I'm not stopping now." With a deep breath, he turned back to his computer, determination hardening in his chest. Victoria thought she was untouchable, but she had underestimated him, and soon, she was going to find out just how wrong she was. The room fell silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that lingered after a joke, or the silence before a toast. No, this was the kind of silence that pressed on your chest, the kind that felt like everyone was holding their breath in unison. John Carter felt the weight of it before he even realized what had happened. He had just walked into the conference room, prepared for a meeting that was supposed to mark the culmination of months of hard work, the merger that would elevate his company to unimaginable heights. The investors had gathered, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, and Victoria Hawthorne stood at the front, her eyes fixed on him, with a look that sent a shiver down his spine. But it wasn't until she spoke that the reality hit him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria's voice rang out, loud enough to fill the entire room. "I'm afraid there's something you should know about our esteemed CEO." The word esteemed dripped with sarcasm. John's stomach twisted, but he kept his composure, his expression calm, his heart pounding. Victoria's gaze never wavered from him as she continued, "This man, who claims to be the head of a successful company, has been using his position to steal proprietary information from this very room. He's been feeding it to competitors, sabotaging negotiations, and undermining our efforts." Gasps rippled through the room. The sound of disbelief and outrage filled the air, but John didn't hear any of it. His mind went numb. He could feel the eyes of the investors on him, their judgment already in the air. Before he could even process what had just happened, Victoria stepped forward, holding up a printed sheet of paper in front of the room. "I've already spoken with the board," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "We've uncovered emails, transactions, everything you need to see. He's been using his position as CEO to line his own pockets and betray your trust." John's blood ran cold. It wasn't true. None of it was true. But the evidence was there, presented in front of him like an undeniable accusation. Fabricated, manipulated, a well-crafted lie. And yet, as the murmurs grew louder, John knew it wouldn't matter. "You can't be serious," one of the investors said, his voice strained with disbelief. But it didn't matter. Victoria was already walking away, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of her lips as she surveyed the room, as if she knew the damage had been done. She was in control now. John stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing, but the reality of the situation slammed into him like a tidal wave. The reputation he had built, the years of blood, sweat, and tears he had put into this company, gone. One accusation, one lie, and everything was collapsing. "You're done," Victoria said over her shoulder, her voice a low, mocking whisper that only he could hear. "It's over." The silence lingered for what felt like an eternity. "John, we need to talk." The voice broke through the haze of shock and anger. It was Maya. She was standing just behind him now, her voice trembling with concern. But there was no time for comfort, no time to think about the past. He had to move. He had to fix this. But how? How could he possibly fight back when the very people he needed to believe in him had already turned against him? His legs felt like jelly as he was escorted out of the room, his head spinning with 1,000 questions. He barely noticed the crowd of executives, their faces a blur of judgment as he passed. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, and he found himself standing alone in the hallway, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. For a moment, he considered walking away, letting it all go. It would be easier. They had all turned their backs on him already. Maybe he wasn't meant to succeed. Maybe he was never meant to be more than just another person who had been lucky enough to get a shot. But then he remembered his father's words. Let your work speak louder than your pride. John's fist clenched at his side. He wasn't going to let Victoria win. Not like this. He couldn't. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. John, we've got to figure this out. It was Carlos, his friend, his ally, the only person who had truly believed in him from the start. I don't know if I can fight this, John muttered, his voice hollow. It's over. She's got the evidence. The board will never listen to me now. Carlos's face was stern. No, you're not giving up. You can't. Look, we've been through worse. You know what this is. It's a setup, a trap. She's trying to take you down, but she's not as smart as she thinks. John met his gaze. What do you mean? Carlos glanced around, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know how she works. She's manipulative, John. She's been doing this for years, but she's also arrogant. She'll slip up. And when she does, we'll be ready. John swallowed, the fire inside him flickering back to life. Carlos was right. He had to fight back. He wasn't going to let Victoria destroy everything he had built. But he needed more. He needed proof. He needed a way to expose the truth. That's when Maya stepped forward, her eyes determined. You're not in this alone, she said firmly. We'll help you. We'll find a way to clear your name. For Dad. For all of us. John looked at his sister, her words cutting through the fog of despair that had clouded his thoughts. She was right. He wasn't alone. There were people who cared about him, people who believed in him. The anger, the frustration, the helplessness, it all turned into something else now. It turned into resolve. He wasn't going to let Victoria win. He wasn't going to let her destroy everything his father had worked for, everything he had worked for. I won't let her get away with this, John said, his voice low and steady. We're going to expose her for what she really is. Maya nodded, a fierce determination in her eyes. You've got this, John. We've got this. Carlos stepped forward, his expression unwavering. Let's show her what happens when she underestimates us. And in that moment, John knew that the fight was far from over. It had only just begun. John Carter walked into the boardroom, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The room fell into a sudden, unnatural silence. All eyes turned to him, but it wasn't the kind of attention he was used to, the kind that recognized his presence. No, this was the kind of attention that saw him as a threat, as an intruder. But he wasn't here to beg for approval. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here to take back what was his. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him, cold, dismissive, but there was something else too. Fear, a flicker in their eyes. They knew what was coming, and they knew they had underestimated him. John, what are you doing here? Victoria's voice sliced through the silence like a blade. It was dripping with disbelief, the venom just under the surface. She hadn't expected him to show up. Not like this. Not in front of the people who held his future in their hands. She thought she had won. John didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he stood still, his gaze sweeping the room. The board members, rich, powerful, each one holding the fate of his company in their hands, shifted uncomfortably under his stare. He could feel their collective judgment, but it didn't matter. None of them knew the truth yet. and that was about to change. He stepped to the center of the room, calm but determined. "You all know me," he said, his voice steady, every word sharp and precise. "But what you don't know is that you've been lied to. About me, about everything." Victoria's lips curled into a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Lied to," she repeated, her tone mocking. "What's this, some kind of dramatic confession? You don't even have the decency to leave quietly. You're a disgrace, John. Your secret's out." John's chest tightened with the weight of the injustice. He had kept his composure, held his tongue for months, but no more. This was the moment. The room was heavy with tension, but he didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. The gasps were almost immediate. He could see Victoria's face shift from disbelief to fury. She knew what was coming, but she didn't realize just how much she had underestimated him. John placed the USB drive on the table, his fingers lingering over it just for a moment before he pushed it across the table toward the head of the board. "You want to know who I really am?" he asked, his voice low but filled with unshakable certainty. "I'm the man who built this company from the ground up. I'm the one who poured everything into it. And I'm the one who's going to destroy the lies you've built." The head of the board, a seasoned man with silver hair, hesitated before plugging the USB drive into the computer. The room was so still you could hear the hum of the machine as it processed the files. Then the screen flickered, and a series of documents flashed up. Financial records, emails, and reports, all of them detailing Victoria's underhanded dealings, her attempts to sabotage the merger, and her efforts to ruin John's reputation. The evidence was undeniable. Victoria's face turned pale as the documents on the screen painted a picture of her corruption. She tried to speak, but her words caught in her throat. The room was silent, except for the clicking of the mouse as the board members scrolled through the evidence. Is this true?" one of the board members asked, his voice shaking. Victoria's arrogance faltered. Her mask of composure cracked as the weight of the evidence sunk in. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was as if her whole empire, built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling before her eyes, and she couldn't stop it. John took a step forward, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You've spent months spreading lies about me, about who I am, about what I've done. You've tried to destroy everything I've built because you're afraid of losing your control. But here's the truth. You didn't just underestimate me. You underestimated the power of integrity. You thought you could break me, but I'm not the one who's broken." The room was still. No one moved, no one breathed. The weight of John's words hung in the air. Victoria's eyes flicked to the investors around her, but they weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at John, at the man she had tried to ruin. John continued, his voice unwavering. "You judged me by the suit I wore, by the way I held myself. You thought I was just another chauffeur, another background character in your little world of privilege and power. But it's not the suit that defines a man. It's what he's built, what he's accomplished, and the people who stand behind him. It's the heart and soul that go into every decision, every sacrifice." He turned to the board members, meeting their eyes one by one. "I didn't get here by chance. I didn't get here by lying or cheating. I got here through hard work, through every rejection, every door slammed in my face. I built this company on the foundation of honesty and integrity, and you're not going to take that from me." Victoria's face was red with fury now, her hands clenched into fists on the table. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her voice rising. "You can't do this. You think they'll believe you. You think they'll believe one man over everything I've built." John didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of her anymore. "You've built nothing but a house of cards, Victoria, and it's collapsing." The room erupted in whispers, the board members exchanging shocked glances. The silence had broken, And now the truth was out. Victoria's carefully constructed image, her control over the room, her power, was slipping away with every passing second. The head of the board turned to Victoria, his voice cold. "We'll need to investigate this further, but it seems clear that your actions have put the integrity of this company in jeopardy." Victoria's face twisted in outrage, but no one was listening to her anymore. The tide had turned, and John had made sure of it. Then, the door to the room opened, and a representative from the gala's sponsoring company walked in. John recognized him immediately, a powerful man who had been present at the gala when Victoria had publicly humiliated him. The man glanced at the screen, taking in the evidence, and then looked directly at Victoria. "I'm sorry, but after reviewing this information, we're severing our ties with your family's firm," he said flatly. "We can't support a business that operates under these conditions." Victoria's mouth dropped open, her world shattering around her. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All her power, all her influence, was crumbling like sand in the wind. John stood tall, his gaze fixed on Victoria. "You thought you could destroy me, Victoria, but it's you who's been destroyed. You judged me for who I appeared to be, but it's who I am inside that mattered. And now, the world knows." The room was silent, but the weight of the truth hung in the air. Victoria's empire was crumbling, and she knew there was no escaping it now. John had won. He had fought back not with violence or rage, but with the truth. And in the end, the truth had been enough. As the board members began to file out, their faces full of respect and awe for John, Victoria stood frozen in place. The arrogant confidence she once wore so easily had completely vanished. She had been exposed, and nothing could ever fix that. John turned to leave, his heart pounding with triumph, but he didn't look back. He had won, and the weight of that victory settled in his chest like a warm light. It wasn't just about the merger. It wasn't about the company. It was about something much bigger, justice. And today, justice had been served. Victoria sat in the sterile, cold room, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her like 1,000 pounds. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady herself, but the damage was done. No matter how much she tried to reclaim her power, to assert her position, she couldn't escape what had happened. It had been a week since John had exposed her, and the world had turned against her. The investors, the board, the public, they had all seen the truth, and it had cost her everything. Her family's company, once untouchable, was now on the brink of collapse. Her reputation, once pristine and carefully constructed, was shattered. There was no hiding now. Her lawyer had tried to spin the story, tried to salvage some semblance of dignity, but it didn't matter. The press had already written their stories. Social media had already buried her under the weight of every racist comment, every moment of privilege she had taken for granted. Her own family turned their backs on her, distancing themselves from the scandal she had caused. And it was all because of John Carter. Victoria had spent so long believing she was invincible, so sure of her position at the top of the food chain. She had never considered that anyone, let alone someone she considered beneath her, would dare to take her down. But John had done it. He had not only exposed her corruption, but had also torn apart everything she thought she controlled. Her mind flashed back to the moment when she'd first realized who John really was. The shock, the disbelief. How could someone like him, someone she had dismissed as a mere chauffeur, be the very person who would bring her empire crashing down? He was supposed to be invisible, insignificant, but he wasn't. She clenched her fists in frustration. She had been so careless. She had underestimated him, ignored his intelligence, his potential, and now she had to face the consequences. The door to her office creaked open, and she looked up, her eyes red from lack of sleep. It was her assistant, nervously holding a stack of papers. "Victoria, "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice small, unsure. Victoria sighed, rubbing her temples. "Send them in," she muttered, already preparing herself for the inevitable. More people wanting to remind her of her failures. But when the person walked in, it wasn't just another faceless lawyer or disgruntled client. It was John Carter. She froze. Her pulse quickened as he walked into the room, his presence commanding, but not in the way she had always assumed. He wasn't the chauffeur anymore. He wasn't the man who had served her at the gala. He was the man who had destroyed her. "John," she said, her voice faltering slightly, "what are you doing here?" John didn't sit down. He didn't offer her any pleasantries. He stood tall, his posture confident, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here to remind you that you can't just erase your actions, Victoria," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You don't get to destroy people's lives and just walk away with a sorry." Victoria's throat tightened. She had spent so many days thinking about what she could say, what she could do to fix this, to make it right. She had considered reaching out to him, offering some kind of apology, something to make the public think she was sorry. But she knew it would never be enough, not after what she had done. I didn't mean to," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were hollow. They meant nothing. John's eyes narrowed slightly, but his face remained calm. "You didn't mean to. Is that your excuse?" he asked. "You didn't mean to ruin my life, my reputation? You didn't mean to destroy everything I've worked for? You didn't mean to put your racism, your arrogance, ahead of the truth?" Victoria swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. She knew he was right. Every word he spoke was true. She had meant every insult, every cruel remark. She had meant to destroy him, and now she was paying the price. "I was wrong," she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything." John took a step closer, but not in anger. He didn't need to be angry anymore. He had already won. The victory wasn't in yelling or in punishing her. It was in the silence, in the way she had been exposed, in the way she had to confront the truth. "Wrong doesn't cut it, Victoria," he said softly, his voice low but firm. "You destroyed my company, tried to ruin my name, and did everything you could to make sure I failed. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that you never once considered the lives you were affecting. The people who worked for me, the employees who depended on us. You didn't care about them." Victoria's eyes watered, but she didn't cry. She didn't deserve to. John continued, his tone never wavering. "You don't get to apologize your way out of this, but what you can do is own up to it. You can admit what you've done, take responsibility, and you can live with the consequences. That's the price you pay for thinking you're untouchable." Her silence spoke volumes. She couldn't even argue with him anymore. There was no defense, no way to salvage her reputation. She had lost it all. John turned to leave, his footsteps measured, deliberate. "The thing is," he said, pausing at the door, "I don't need your apology. What I need is for you to understand that people like you don't get to play with people like me anymore, and I'm going to make sure of that." Victoria stood frozen, her mind reeling. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality, and she was left alone in the office, the weight of her actions hanging over her like a dark cloud. The next few months were a whirlwind. John's company continued to grow, its success undeniable. The merger had gone through, stronger than ever. But more importantly, John had kept his promise to his late father and to himself. He used his newfound power, his success, to create opportunities for others, especially those who had been overlooked and underestimated like he had. Community initiatives were established to help underprivileged youth pursue tech careers, scholarships were granted, and mentorship programs began to take root. It was a way for John to give back, to show the world that success wasn't just about money and power. It was about lifting others up, helping them achieve what they thought was impossible. But as for Victoria, her downfall had only just begun. She faced legal repercussions for her actions, her company's stock plummeting, and the social ostracism that came with being publicly exposed as a racist manipulator. Every attempt to rebuild her reputation fell flat. No one was interested in her apologies. No one was interested in her sob stories. They had seen the real her, and they weren't forgetting. John didn't need to destroy her. She had done that all on her own. He didn't need to ruin her career. She had already ruined it herself. His victory wasn't in her defeat. It was in the lives he had changed, the legacy he was building. He stood at the forefront of his company, surrounded by a new generation of young tech leaders, people who had been given the opportunities they deserved because John had refused to back down. The world had tried to break him. They had tried to put him in his place. But John Carter had built something far greater than any of them could understand. And it wasn't just a company. It was a movement. As John looked out at the horizon, the future stretched out before him, full of possibility. He had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they didn't belong. He had built his empire on integrity, and that was something no one could ever take away. And as for Victoria, she would never get the chance to underestimate anyone again, not ever. The gala was a dazzling spectacle of lights, laughter, and music, a stark contrast to the tension-filled nights that had preceded it. The grand ballroom sparkled with hope, the kind of hope John Carter had always believed in, the hope that one person could change everything. Months had passed since the day he had taken back control, but tonight felt like the culmination of all that hard work, the physical manifestation of everything he had fought for. It wasn't just a charity gala. It was a celebration of unity, of progress. People from all walks of life had gathered under one roof. There were tech innovators, educators, students, and even former adversaries, now realizing the power of togetherness. The room buzzed with conversation, a beautiful blend of cultures and backgrounds, all here for a common cause. John stood at the center of the room, his eyes sweeping over the guests, his chest swelling with pride. He had always kept his vision clear, focused on what mattered: justice, opportunity, equality. Tonight, those principles were on full display. This wasn't just about his success anymore. It was about creating opportunities for others who had been denied them for far too long. Maya stood beside him, her smile radiant as she chatted with a group of young tech enthusiasts. He watched her for a moment, feeling a warmth in his chest. She had been there through it all, pushing him when he needed it most, reminding him of the values that had always kept him grounded. She was as much a part of this victory as he was. "Look at them," Maya said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "You did this, John. You gave them a chance." John nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His gaze shifted, and for a brief moment, it landed on the far side of the room, where Victoria Hawthorne stood, far removed from the crowd, her back slightly hunched, her eyes distant. She had come, not as a guest of honor, but as a reminder of the bitter journey they had all been through. She was no longer the powerful socialite who once dictated the room. Instead, she was a shadow of her former self, working for an NGO as part of her restitution, trying to find redemption in the very spaces she had once sought to dominate. The contrast was stark. Victoria had tried to destroy him, tried to belittle him, but now, she was just another face in the crowd. Her eyes met his for a fleeting moment, but she quickly looked away, unable to mask the shame that had become her constant companion. John didn't feel satisfaction, not in the way people might have expected. There was no triumph in her downfall, no victory in seeing her broken. He had won, yes, but it wasn't about revenge. He hadn't destroyed her, she had destroyed herself. "Do you ever think about what she tried to do to you?" Maya asked, her voice soft. John shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "I used to, but revenge isn't the answer. Justice isn't about revenge, Maya. It's about setting things right." Maya looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "Setting things right? So, what, you're just going to let her get away with it?" "No," he said firmly, his voice steady. "She's paying for it every day. Her actions caught up with her, but I didn't need to be the one to make her pay. Life did that for me." Maya didn't say anything else, but she understood. She understood that John's strength wasn't in the way he crushed his enemies, but in the way he built something that would outlast them all. He had found a way to win without becoming the villain, and that, in itself, was a victory. The night wore on, but John remained at the heart of it all, greeting guests, speaking with young students, and listening to the stories of those whose lives had been changed by the initiatives he had started. This was what mattered to him, seeing the people he had helped grow and flourish, seeing the impact of his work stretch beyond his own success. He approached the stage, where a young girl, no more than 12, was about to speak. Her name was Emily, and she had been one of the first students to receive a scholarship through John's foundation. As she stepped up to the microphone, her hands shook slightly, but her voice was strong. "I used to think tech was for people like them," she said, nodding toward the older professionals sitting at the front. People who went to Ivy League schools, who wore fancy suits, and who had everything handed to them. But then I met Mr. Carter, and I realized that people like me, we deserve a chance too. We can do this. We can build things that change the world." The room erupted in applause, and John felt something stir within him, a pride so deep, so intense, that it took his breath away. This was the moment. This was why he had fought so hard, not for himself, not for recognition, but for moments like this, for the Emilys of the world who needed to believe that their dreams weren't too big, that they could reach for the stars no matter where they started. He stepped forward, his heart full, and as he reached the stage, Emily beamed at him. "You're going to do great things," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I'm here to make sure you have every chance to do them." As he spoke, he couldn't help but think of the journey it had taken to get here. The struggles, the setbacks, the people who had tried to tear him down. None of it had been easy, but it had been worth it. Every moment of hardship, every time he had been told he wasn't good enough, it had all led him here, to this point where he was changing lives. From the back of the room, he caught a glimpse of someone who made his heart tighten in his chest. A young girl, no more than 10, was standing near the door, her eyes fixed on him, a look of awe on her face. In her hands, she held a blueprint, sketches of something, maybe a tech project, maybe a dream. But whatever it was clear that she saw something in John. She saw the future. For a moment, their eyes locked. She smiled shyly, and John returned the smile, his heart swelling. She didn't know it yet, but in that moment, she had already taken the first step toward her own future. She had already decided to reach for the stars, and maybe, just maybe, John's journey would be the spark that ignited hers. As the night came to a close, John stood outside the venue, taking in the cool night air. The city skyline stretched out before him, a symbol of everything that was possible, everything that could be built. He didn't need the recognition anymore. He didn't need the applause. He had built something far more important, something that would outlast him, something that would keep growing long after he was gone. And as he looked up at the stars, he knew that the legacy he was creating wasn't just his. It was for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, for everyone who had ever been underestimated, It was for the young girl with the blueprint in her hands, for every student who would now have the chance to chase their dreams. It was a legacy of hope, of belief in what's possible, and in the power of one person to change the world. John Carter had won, not because he had defeated someone else, but because he had built something that would never be destroyed. He had created a future that was brighter for everyone, and that was all the victory he needed.